Gary Morishima is a graduate of the University of Washington with a BS in mathematics and a PhD in quantitative science and environmental management. From 1974 to present, Gary has served as a National Resource Management Technical Advisor to the President of the Quinault Indian Nation. From 1976 to date, he has served as an Executive Board Member for the Intertribal Timber Council. For the last 46 years, Gary has been the CEO of Morishima LLC, a firm specializing in natural resource management, computer simulation, and statistical analysis. Gary is a current member of the U.S. Forest Service Tribal Relations Task Force and Implementation Team, the National Advisory Committee on Climate Change, the National Resource Science, and the Fish and Wildlife Native American Policy Team. He is the U.S. Chair for several technical committees of the Pacific Salmon Commission. Gary is a member of the former chair of the Salmon Technical Team of the Pacific Fishery Management Council, and a former member of the Salmon and Steelhead Advisory Commission for the U.S. Department of Commerce. Gary is a recipient of Boeing Company's Pride and Excellence Award and an Earl Wilcox National Award winner for outstanding contributions in Indian forestry. Please welcome Gary Morishima.
Thank you, Jim. My job today is a pretty easy one, I think, and that's just to introduce the other folks that are going to give you the real information. But I'm here to primarily to try to start the wheels turning and get the juices flowing. So I'm going to give you some things to think about this morning. First of all, this was once Indian country. There were no boundaries, there were no borders. There was just the ability of Indian tribes to interact with their resources and their environments to develop their cultures and ways of life. But what once was began to change about 500 years ago. And I'm not sure how many of those you can read this little caption here, but you can see in that picture there, that's good old Chris. And he says, oh goody. You know, there are lots and lots of natives to exploit and spread diseases and boss around. So that's basically one of the things that happened. Well, this is a very interesting graph, and I hope I can figure out how to get this to work. Is there a pointer here, Jim, that I can? No, I mean, I just need to start. It's a very interesting film that was put out by E-History, and I found it quite intriguing in terms of the picture of the displacement of tribes from what is now known as the United States of America. And this says that the United States seized about 1.5 billion acres from indigenous peoples. And this is just a time lapse showing you the time history of how tribes were displaced from this country. And it's pretty fascinating to me, just in terms of looking at these large chunks of land that get converted from blue to white. And eventually we will see where current Indian homelands remain. So that's the picture as of 2010. So today, only really islands of Indians remain on the landscape, and these are the territories and the homelands where tribes can assert some degree of control over the management of the resources that they have access to. But one of the problems that Indian country is facing, and we're beginning to recognize more and more, is that America's forests are in trouble. We are losing our working forest, that we're seeing increasing political conflicts, particularly on federal lands. Legal challenges, our forests are being converted to other uses. We're seeing catastrophic losses from wildfire, insects, and disease. Growing uncertainty from climate change, invasive species, infrastructure loss, loss of skilled labor, poor domestic markets, increased use of substitutes and imports, and the urban populace itself. The general public is culturally and politically oblivious to issues involving management of our forests. So that means that more and more our forests have been influenced by special interests and those folks that feel that they have more to say about how our forests should be managed than the general public. These problems are mounting, and we really can't afford to wait. We're seeing rapid paces of change, greater uncertainty, and the need to understand the risks and to set priorities and how we're going to go about addressing the problems that are facing our forests. So we've got to choose where we're going to put the issues that are confronting us. We've got several buckets that can be used. One of them is not important and not urgent. Another one is not important but urgent. Another one is important but not urgent. And then you've got the important and urgent. So we need to essentially identify the issues that we're confronting and which ones we're going to choose and how we're going to deal with them. Here's a picture of what's happening with wildfires. We've heard throughout this session increasing problems with the cost of wildfires. Wildfires now account for about 50% of the budget of the U.S. Forest Service. We're seeing in 2012 some 9.3 million acres of forest were burned. The U.S. Forest Service only harvested about 200,000. We're seeing 65 to 82 million acres of Forest Service lands at high risk of wildfires. And we see that insects and disease are threatening 58 million acres of forest lands in the United States. So our wildfires are also affecting reservations in every part of the country. Rincon, Rodeo Tenescan, Cold Springs, the Carlton Complex in Washington State, Firestone Flats. All of these are very large fires that had very severe consequences for the forests, the fish and wildlife, the soils, and the water resources that those forests affect. And we're seeing other threats to our forests, from fragmentation and conversion. We're seeing trespass activities occurring. Marijuana grow operations, they steal land, they pollute the water, and they trash the environment. They're threatening many species as well of concern for ESA, raising ESA concerns. We're seeing invasive species, things even like earthworms are impacting forest reproduction in the Midwest and Northeast. We're seeing white pine, blister rust, and climate change. We're seeing drought. All of these factors are changes. And one of the problems in trying to contend with these is that we've got an alphabet soup of acronyms and issues and topics that people are trying to come up with and trying to figure out how we're going to manage our forests. What kind of tools do we have? We've got water administrative procedures, we've got IFMAT, we've got law, we have visions, governance, we have money, ESA, science, executive direction, DEPA, and the whole works. So we've got a virtual alphabet soup of issues that we have to deal with. This creates not only a problem of understanding what all these acronyms mean, but it creates a very fractured picture. And one of the things that Humpty Dumpty found out is that once things break, it doesn't matter how hard you really try, that when you try to put things back together, it's just somehow it's just not the same. So, what is it we're facing in terms of sustainability? We've heard yesterday, or the day before, concepts of sustainability, and we heard IFMAT's advice. And IFMAT said that Indian forest programs have to have 4 things. They've got to be assured of predictable, consistent, and adequate funding, that they have to have access to up-to-date technical and research support. They've got to be guided by each tribe's visions for its forests, and it's got to have a capable workforce committed to protecting tribal resources. Graphically, FNAT's advice was presented in this kind of a Venn diagram, social, ecological, economic, all leading to an intersection of sustainability. I've got a little bit different view of what sustainability is, and it's a simple formula, but it's not really that simple. But it basically means that well-being, and part of this formula is missing, is basically equal to values over cost. So you can increase the well-being of the management of forests by increasing the values that are received or reducing the cost. So ultimately that ends up with, how is it that we can sustain what we want? Why do we want to sustain it? And the big question is, how do we sustain it? So the what? All of us, I believe, want to maintain the health and productivity of the land and the human communities that depend upon it. We want to sustain the physical and spiritual integrity of the places of special meaning. But why do we want to do this? All of us here feel that we have a general obligation of stewardship and obligations to the generations yet unborn. We don't own the land, we're borrowing it from our children and their children. So the ecological and economic functions that are essential to the spatial, temporal, and cultural connections that sustain the water, soil, air, and all things that walk, swim, crawl, or fly, or grow roots are important. And they're connected to human communities in countless ways. Phil mentioned in his comments this morning an organization called HONOR. And HONOR stands as an acronym for Our Natural Resources, but it's the way that we pronounce it that I think is important, because it's honored. And how do we come up with that name? Well, a few years ago when we were talking about forming an organization that had the capability of spanning across the breadth of interests and expertise that lies out there in Indian country, we needed to find a way of bringing those disparate interests together. We stretched our heads for a long time, and then we looked and saw on the back of a t-shirt of a Mescalero Apache youth who happened to be attending the resource day at the meeting. And on the back of that t-shirt was a simple three phrases. Honor the past, let's embrace the present, and care for the future. The big question that we're facing is how. So how involves many different steps. We've got to assess, we've got to share, we've got to collaborate, and ultimately we have to act. We know for certain that we cannot do this alone, that we're working on a fractured landscape where the spatial and temporal scope of actions that we need to sustain the viability of the ecological, economic, and cultural systems, that those far exceed the ability of tribal decision domains in the islets of Indians. So that means we have to cross those boundaries, find a way across those boundaries, and build partnerships. And to do that, communication is going to have to be a key. That we have to inform and educate ourselves and our partners. We've got to develop those partnerships and networks across the landscape boundaries that remain functional over time, because the players change, both within the tribal and non-tribal communities. So we have to find a way of institutionalizing these relationships to access the funding and expertise, to open the doors, to increase the efficiencies and generate ideas. And one of the things with partnerships is that the more people that you can involve in partnerships, the more resources that you have. Intellectual resources, financial resources, those kinds of things are going to be increasingly important in the future. The big question, I think, is that how can we speak of sustainability in a world of change? We know that we cannot expect to restore conditions that existed in the past. We cannot expect things to remain as they are today. So how do we work with this? Sustainability under change. We can try to sustain the viability of ecological, economic, and cultural systems on the landscape. But in order to do this, we have to come up with another acronym. And my acronym happens to be MAP, which stands for Mitigate, Adapt, and Prepare. Well, what does mitigate means? Well, mitigate means that we have to lessen the severity or risk of an undesirable thing happening in the future, something bad happening in the future. So we can do that by trying to reduce that impact or counteracting it. And that's got at its center the concept of risk management. What values are really at risk here? How do we mitigate for them? We've got to identify those, we've got to analyze them, we've got to evaluate, but it all centers around our concepts and perceptions of risk, both in terms of the severity and the time in which those risks are going to occur. But what's adapt mean? Well, one of the things that I want you to give some thought to is hubris. And what is hubris? Hubris is really sort of arrogance. One of the challenges that we continually, or I continually run up against, is the belief among some that we can engineer ourselves out of all these problems. That man is in control of everything. And that's simply not true, as we all know. That when we're dealing with things that are affecting our forests, we're dealing with things that impact us both near and far. Near and far, both spatially and temporally. When we're dealing with climate change, for example, many of the sources of carbon that impact climate originated decades and decades ago and thousands of miles away. And these things are only now beginning to materialize in accelerating rate. So stuff happens. We can't anticipate everything. We don't know what's going to happen. So what we can do is expect the unexpected. That we need to respond both on an emergency basis when those crises happen to arise, whether it's a wildfire or a flood or a drought or whatever it is, and gradual changes that we can have the luxury of spending a little bit more time to think about and how do we react to. So what we need to do with adapting is adjusting or modifying to produce outcomes that are more desirable or less undesirable. And we need to be opportunistic, which means that we have to take advantage of creativity, the skills, the knowledge, and the resources that we may have and all our partners may have to bring to bear. We need to have the tools that we can bring to bear to these problems. Tools like restoring fire on the landscape. Fire is a natural part of many of the landscapes that tribes deal with. So we have to find a way of bringing that fire back onto the land in a way that's going to be helpful in terms of preserving the options, preserving our ability to adapt in the future open. So prepare, got a few simple steps on prepare. Last step in the acronym of MAP. Do your homework, right? Identify the major challenges and risks. Develop some proactive measures to prevent or reduce adverse impacts. To plan and prepare for things that can't be reasonably expected to happen. And identify alternatives and contingencies. To do that, to move forward, we need to have a vision. A vision that has two primary roots. One of them is leadership and the ability to reconcile differences on a fractured landscape. And a capacity to actually do something, a capacity to implement. So vision without the means to implement is really nothing more than a dream. So we have to have the capacity to actually act and treat the land. So it's plan, prepare, and practice. So it's not going to matter how hard we try or how much we want to try. And it's not just about how much effort that we put out. If the pieces don't fit, it's just not going to work. In order for MAP to work, we need to be flexible and smart, and we need to have the right tools and to use them in the right places at the right time. So the pieces have to fit. And one of the interesting things about islands of Indianness and tribes and their particular position within the political and natural resource landscape is that tribes are really experts in fragmentation, because living on these islands of remaining Indians, they recognize that the ability to maintain the ecological functions essential to sustain their cultures and lifestyles and economies across the landscape, that they no longer can do this on their own, that they have to build those partnerships that cross political, administrative, economic, and intellectual boundaries. They have to be able to exercise creativity and innovation. We've heard a lot over the past few days about the lack of adequate funding for Indian forest management. But what does that mean? It really means that tribes are finding other ways to get the job done on the ground. They're developing these programs, and they're very difficult to sustain, but yet the pieces are essential in order for them to be able to manage the lands that are trusted to their care. So this lack of resources, lack of staffing, means that tribes have to be creative, they've got innovative in terms of mitigating for the deficiencies in federal appropriations. They've got to be experts in putting these pieces together. So some of these pieces I wanted to talk about are the FIRMA. The first one is the FIRMA, the National Indian Forest Resources Management Act. What that does is affirms the federal trust responsibility for the management of Indian forests. The Indian forests are trust resources, which means that the United States has an obligation to maintain the health and productivity of the trust corpus. Also, the format establishes certain statutory requirements for the management of Indian forests. They include the requirement for sustained yield management. The FIRMA also includes provisions that support integrated resource management plans, not just forest management plans, but it was more of a visionary kind of legislation, because it said that you've got to manage the forest within the context of the ecosystems and the community. It contains provisions dealing with workforce development, and contains provisions for periodic independent assessments. The IFMAP reports that John Gordon and I talked about on the first day. So these IFMAP reports are very important because they're periodic and independent evaluations. They're not a sort of self-evaluation of self. They report the good, the bad, and the ugly to Congress, the administration, and the tribe. Because if we don't understand the conditions and the challenges that we're facing, we really can't deal with them. We can't do anything. So they identify strengths and weaknesses. The periodic assessments also enable us to monitor change. Are we making progress? Are we actually moving forward and addressing the fundamental issues that have to be concerned to improve the status of forest and forestry in Indian country? And most importantly, I think, they identify the deficiencies, but also some recommendations for how do we correct these deficiencies. The Tribal Forest Protection Act that Jim spoke about on the first day. The Tribal Forest Protection Act 2 affirms the fiduciary responsibility of the United States for protecting trust lands and trust resources and cultural resources of tribes. The TFPA is an important tool that will enable us to improve the ability of tribes to access and treat the hazardous conditions on Forest Service and BLM lands that are posing risks to tribal lands and resources. Anchor forests, a concept that Bill has mentioned and others throughout this conference. What are anchor forests? Well, they're really large blocks of land that we can count on to be dedicated to long-term forest stewardship, with commodity production as a major output. And commodity production is an extremely important aspect of utilization. The name of this organization, the Intertribal Timber Council, was a matter of some debate when we were first forming this organization. Some wanted to call it the Intertribal Forestry Council or Intertribal Ecological Council. But the founders of the Intertribal Timber Council said, no, it's going to be Intertribal Timber Council because we understand and recognize that utilization is essential to maintain the health of the resource. It's essential to maintain the health of the communities that depend upon those resources, and it's essential to maintain the fish, wildlife, the water, and all the other things that we care about that our forests protect. So we purposely chose the term intertribal timber council to get that point across. So, Anchor Forest is focused on efforts to restore management, harvesting, transportation, and processing infrastructure, because all of these components are essential to sustainability. You can't just manage the land. You've got to have some way of paying for that. If we're talking about cross-boundary utilization and cross-boundary maintenance of forest on the landscape, the other owners as well have to be able to benefit from it. That you can't expect them to maintain their forest and forest condition and allow us to reap the benefits without getting anything in return. So cross-boundary collaboration, partnerships, attract resources. So that's one of the things that we're looking for in Anchor Forest. So what are the things that work, that make Anchor Forest work? What are the elements that we think are important to, in order to enable us to develop Anchor Forest across the land? So Anchor Forest, we think, look at the prime candidates. The prime candidates are Indian forests and possibly state forests. Forests that are going to have long-term commitments to land tenure, forests that are going to be managed with commodity production in mind, forests that are going to be managed with balance in mind. We can't really look that much to industrial lands. Industrial lands, the ownerships are being converted more and more to REITs and TIMOs. Those organizations that don't have a long-term vested interest in stewardship, frankly. Their interest is single-minded, and that's generating revenue and profit for their shareholders. We can't turn so much to the small forest landowners who own another 50% of the forest lands in the United States, because they have many diverse interests. Many of them individually have very strong ties to their lands, but we're looking at long-term sustainability. And with small forest landowners, we're confronted with the problem of change. That as the current generation, as the current owners of that land sort of pass on and kind of leave those properties to future generations, trying to attract future generations into being forest landowners is a major challenge. And we've got institutional barriers that are in the way, things like tax codes that interfere with the ability to transfer lands and to retain it in forest stewardship. We're also saying a number of things that we want to accomplish with our Anchor Forest pilot project that we have going in Eastern Washington. And that's to look at different conditions, different circumstances. There are 3 centers that we're looking at. One in South Central Washington, where Phil and the Yakima Nation are from. Another one is in North Central Washington, where the Colvilles are involved, and another in Northeastern Washington. All of these factors, all of these places have different characteristics. They got different land ownership patterns, different kinds of infrastructure remaining, and different challenges in terms of the kinds of the social and economic pressures that are being brought to bear. So we hope in the Anchor Forest process to learn and understand what is it that can make Anchor Forest successful, and what is it that we need to do in order to improve the ability to utilize this concept to help improve the health and productivity of our forests across the landscape, across the boundaries. So why is it tribes are important in this? So the first concept that I mentioned the other day was tribal sovereignty. And why is that important? It's important because tribes are political sovereigns, and they're separate from the United States. They're a part of the American system of government, but they have a special relationship with the United States. That relationship requires the United States to consult with tribes on all actions that can adversely affect their rights and interests. And that consultation is supposed to occur before the fact, not after the fact. And it needs to be substantive. What does consultation mean? It really means it's part of that dialogue that has to occur. If you have differences as sovereigns, you have to have the opportunity to discuss those differences and to reconcile them. Consultation is not a checkbox on a federal agency's administrative list of things that it has to do. It's not a checkbox where all they have to do is to send out a Dear Tribal Leader letter saying we invite you to consult. It's not a process where the federal government can ask tribes or ask others for their opinions and then ignore it because they want to do something else. It really means that it's part of that dialogue that has to occur between governments to reconcile those differences and find a way to move forward. There are also sort of special rights and interests that tribes have and can be brought to the table. Some of them are embodied in law, like religious freedoms, protection of sacred sites, cultural resources. All of these things are certain rights that tribes have as a result of legislation that's been enacted over the years. Tribes also have reserved rights. Rights to hunt, fish, trap and gather, fish, wildlife, and plants, and the capacity of the environment to continue to produce them so that the reserved rights remain meaningful. It doesn't make any sense to have a treaty right that ensures that you have the right to take fish if the habitat isn't capable of producing those fish. Similarly for wildlife and the plants that tribal culture depends upon. So that those reserved rights carry certain kinds of obligations and responsibilities on behalf of the United States that only the tribes really have the ability to enforce and to make sure that they are honored. Another fact is that tribes are co-managers of shared resources. If you look at the treaties and all those other kinds of things, those treaties talk about cessation of lands in return for certain other rights. But they don't talk about cessation of the right and the ability of tribes to influence the management of those lands, the fish, the wildlife, the forest resources, the water, all of those things. Treaty law really is centered in the concept that treaties are not a grant of rights to tribes, but a grant from tribes to the United States and a reservation of those rights which were not granted. Water rights is a very key item that's going to become more and more important to sustainability of our forests and our communities. And tribes have the senior water rights because they were the first people here. So they have water rights that are senior to those of all other competing users. And tribes as governments, they have the ability to regulate air and water within their jurisdictions. And the United States policy is supporting the ability of tribes to exercise self-determination and self-governance. These are fundamental concepts of something called the trust relationship. What is the trust relationship? It's not a one-sided responsibility. And it's not something that only deals with the fiduciary obligations of the United States to protect the ability, protect the productivity of the trust corpus. The part of the trust responsibility is tied to the need to support the ability of tribes to become self-governing and the ability of tribes to govern their own selves, their lands, and their peoples. Other things that are important, you've got permanent tribal presence on the land. And that's essential if we're talking about sustainability. Because look around you at the partners, right? We've heard this morning about some of the challenges with current turnover of federal agencies and people that sit across our table. Every 3 or 4 years, the people that we've been working so hard to build relationships with, they're somewhere else. They've retired or they've moved on to other positions of responsibility. So where's that continuity going to come from? It's going to come from people that have ties to the land, ties to the place, ties and understanding as to what needs to be done on the land to care for. So those generations of place-based experience and knowledge represent a connectedness with the earth, a connectedness of language and culture and communities to the resources in a particular place. That's tied within a moral and cultural imperative. Profound stewardship ethic, a tie and a recognition that our responsibility lies to the generations yet unborn. It also talks about balance and harmony, that we recognize that all things are connected, that we're dealing with temporal, continuity, they can honor the past, embrace the present, and create that future. It also means that we're dealing with different cultures, different ways of thinking towards science and information and our ability to manage. Humility, not hubris. The man is a part of nature, not apart from it. So this is a graph, a little graph that try to help you visualize some of the important differences between tribal ways of thinking and Western ways of thinking. The terms emic and etic, those are probably not too familiar to you in this audience, but they're from cultural anthropology. And what they mean is basically the context in which information and knowledge and perceptions are understood, viewed, and used. So on the tribal side, it's basically emic, which means that it's part of the observer and the behavior of that individual as part of that system. Etic, the Western, is basically isolated. So on the tribal side, we're looking at how is information gathered and transmitted and used. It involves things like having a good mind, concept of guardianship, customary law, cosmovision, reciprocity, obligations, and relationships. And you can look at that contrasted with the Western etic version, right? It's information, it's data, it's economics, it's intellectual property, it's trying to come up with common heritage within a common domain, secular knowledge, and open knowledge. These things don't work very well when we're working with Indian country. So again, man's place in the environment. It's important to remember that man is a part of nature, which means that he's got a certain humility, that he recognizes that he is not in control, but that all things are connected. And the etic one is that man is apart from nature, or hubris, or man is in control of everything and is capable of figuring out how to get out of this mess through intellectual power on its own. So what's the tribal paradigm for man? Respect and utilization are two sides of the same piece of the puzzle. These are commonly cared for in terms of stewardship and reciprocity. If you care for the land, then it can care for you. If you don't care for the land, then you're going to pay the price. So putting the pieces together, some of them I've talked about, NFIRMA, the IFMAT reports, balance, permanent presence, Tribal Forest Protection Act, sovereignty and political relationships, the trust responsibility, traditional knowledge, interconnectedness, reserved rights, stewardship ethics, and anchor force. These are just a few of the pieces that we've got on the table that we have to figure out how we're going to make work. But the key pieces, again, are tribal sovereignty and political relationships and that trust relationship with the United States. So we live in a world of increasing uncertainty. And the only thing that we can count on is change. Change in the experience of tribes living on the land for thousands of years, from the last ice age to what we're seeing today. Those tribal communities have undergone tremendous change, and yet they survived. They survived because they were able to adapt. The tribal wisdom and experience are going to be crucial to our ability to adapt and survive together. We've got to find a way of working across the landscape. The all lands, all hands vision that was expressed by Secretary Vilsack a few years ago in Seattle, I think are important. All of us have special skills and knowledge and pieces that can be brought to the table, but they have to be put together in a way that enables us to reach a common mind, develop that common vision. We've got to act now to get on the same page, to find the same visions, to be able to work from the same agenda. Thank you very much. I hope that helps a little bit.